Woody's 101, Module 5. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, tree anatomy and physiology. We could spend, again, a whole semester of school on this information, but I'm going to try to condense it all into a much shortened version and just give you the basic facts and essential information that is necessary to help with the examination process. But also kind of reiterate and emphasize some of the things that are in the study guide that can help. So one of the most important first steps in tree care is knowing your tree. I mean, how can we even operate our bodies without understanding our bodies and how they function? We know that very intimately. Well, a tree is a dynamic living organism that has a physiological and biological processes as well that we need to understand. I was fortunate enough to hear Dr. Shigo, our father of modern arboriculture, speak once, and he said there's three things that an arborist needs to know. You need to know your tree, you need to know your tree, you need to know your tree. That's how important biology and physiology was to Dr. Shigo, because how can we treat a tree, either prune it or diagnose it or fertilize it without understanding how the processes work. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can actively and ethically administer arboricultural practices and care by knowing how it's going to respond. And we're going to look at some of those things that will make a difference in how you look at tree work from this point. Trees are the largest and oldest living organism on Earth, and they live their entire life in the same spot and survive, even with all the damage and crazy stuff that we inflict on them. They are the perfect biological machine. They're air scrubbers, they're water filters, they're producers, not consumers, so they can live their entire life in one spot. They are complex biological systems that respond to cultural practices and external stimuli. So we've got to understand how the tree is going to respond physiologically, such as from pruning, that will allow us to manage and maintain these trees more effectively and also understand their outcomes. So let's start with some tree schematics. Now this is kind of like the basic breakdown of the tree, understanding the outer bark layer where the cambium layer is, the inner wood, and of course the heartwood. And we're going to look at a few tree schematics, but one thing I want to make sure that we understand is we oversimplify tree physiology and their outlines dramatically to the point where we can understand. Trees, again, are very complex, and it's not so simple as we see here. There's a lot going on in there, and it's not quite as clean and neat as we'd like to make out in some of our diagrams and graphics. So the question is, how does a tree grow? In humans and other animals, growth can occur in all parts of our body. Our bones and skin are totally different in the fact that we generate new cells and have specialized tissue for each organ, each inch of our body. Where trees are a little bit different. They grow in two different ways. They grow radially and they grow vertically. So trees basically have two types of meristematic tissue. The primary or apical meristems, which allow for shoot and root elongations. That's what causes a tree to kind of grow and stretch its branches and get a bigger canopy and roots. And they also have a secondary or lateral meristematic tissue, and this is what causes the girth or the trunk of the tree to increase as well. So between those two types of tissue, they're able to grow out and larger because of the differentiation between that tissue. The particular growing points within those tissues include the vascular cambium. Now this is where pretty much all the action takes place as far as the plumbing. This is where we find the most intense zone of differentiation of cells. That's where the xylem and phloem is located, and these are and then we also have the lateral meristems that increase in diameter in those areas as well. Now the core cambium is what gives rise to the bark layer as phloem and xylem dies off and we create new xylem tissue. That becomes the heartwood or inner wood, and when phloem dies, it kind of gets pushed into the bark layer and it becomes that periderm and outside bark, which is the armor of the tree. So if we were to look at a tree from kind of straight down the trunk, it might look a lot like this. This is basically just a set of pipes put together, or you could even put a handful of straws together, and the tree would look like just a bunch of pipes or circles that are arranged to move food and water throughout the plant system. The tree structure, if we were to take a close look at how that's arranged, we'll see that we have the bark layer, which is that protective layer. Then we have the phloem, which is also a group of vessels, but they transport a specific type of food. And then also we have the xylem rings, which are the inside. Now, the zone that separates the xylem and the phloem is called the vascular cambium. This is that area of differentiation and cell division that creates new xylem and new phloem. If we start out with the bark moving inward, we can see that the bark is basically there to prevent any injury to the vascular cambium. Remember that the vascular cambium, the xylem, the active xylem vessels and living phloem vessels are just under the bark layer. They don't go throughout the tree. The majority of the tree is actually dead tissue. It's heartwood and used for carbon sequestration and storage. Just beneath the bark layer is where we find that cambium tissue. And if any injury to this will actually cause a separation of those vessels, it's just like cutting the rope or cutting the straw or the pipe in half, and you won't get any transfer of those nutrients or that food or that water. And so as a result, the tree dies. So any injury to that can cause injury or death to that tree. Let's take a look at some of the particular conducting vessels within the tree plumbing system. So when we look at the xylem, a couple things about the xylem. The xylem is primarily for the transport of water, or the conductance of water and minerals that are dissolved in that water. Xylem is also non-living tissue that supports the weight of the tree. It also acts as storage for carbohydrates on the interior of the tree and contains some special phytochemicals that help defend against disease and decay. And xylem vessels make up the bulk of the wood of the tree. It's important to remember that xylem vessels are non-living, but they are involved in the transport system. Growth rings are the result of xylem vessels as well. When we see the different dark and light rings, the dark is typically what we call late wood or late season growth, which occurs in the fall in temperate areas. And the light rings are the spring growth, and they're usually a little bit wider because the growing season is much longer. And so those are basically just vessels that have been moved in towards the tree and now become a vessel for storage. Now the phloem is located on the outside of the cambium tissue, and where the xylem is on the inside, the phloem is on the outside closest to the bark. It's involved for the primary transport of sugars and energy to the tree. So it also moves in different directions. It is actually part of the bark layer and is made primarily of living cells, which is very different from xylem. Xylem is all dead tissue or non-living, whereas phloem is active living tissue. It's important to remember that designation for future reference. Now the translocation happens in a couple different ways. Phloem transport is actually active transport, so it needs energy in order to occur. And that happens through photosynthesis. Now, phloem transports photosynthates and other processed energy that the tree creates. And the leaves are the source for that. And then what will happen is the rest of the plant becomes a sink area. So it will move these energy sources to different parts of the plant where needed. Usually, though, the plant only moves it to a very localized area. It's not like it moves it throughout the entire tree. It usually stays very close proximity to the source. And again, important thing to remember for future reference is it takes energy to actually move these photosynthates to the sink areas. Now, when we come to the xylem vessels, the key thing to remember here is not only that it's non-living, but xylem vessels are passive transport of water. Phloem moves bidirectional, meaning it can move up and down the phloem vessels, where xylem vessels conduct water upward only. So that's critical and really makes a difference when it comes to the application of pesticides. When we inject trees, we rely on that upward movement of the xylem vessels to move the chemical or active ingredient to the source and sink areas. We've heard this word before, angiosperms. We kind of have that connotation of hardwoods, but they're typically the broadleaf trees. And there's a couple of different types of vascular arrangements that we need to be aware of. Hardwood species typically have vessels that produce these early and late season growth. These are usually trees that include elms, oaks, and ash trees. You can see they have very wide rings and very big transport straws, so to speak. Diffuse porous includes your what we typically consider softwood species that include like your maples, sycamores, poplar species. These are vessels that are pretty much of uniform size and more densely packed and arranged. So, and where this really comes into play is especially when we're looking at the movement of water. Some of the vessels, especially ring porous vessels, get clogged with bacterial diseases much more readily, but they also move chemicals through microinfusion much quicker as well. So, these are some of the things that are important to understand the vascular arrangements and how it dictates practice and also diagnostic issues. Gymnosperms, which typically include our conifers, have a little different vascular arrangement where we see bordered pits and tracheids. They're kind of like a separation of the pipes. They're not continuous, but they are kind of connected together, and the conducting materials or the food and water and nutrition move through these tracheids from one vessel to the other. Not a big deal, but it's a matter of understanding how they work because they are much slower in the conductance process, which can influence plant health care. Ray cells are very important cells that have kind of a different arrangement. They're made for transporting different assimilates in a more cross-sectional way. And they also are very important for helping with restricting the movement of decay radially around the tree. They're primarily composed of very specialized parenchyma cells, which have a lot to do with growth and especially the formation of wound wood. And they're also very important for transporting carbohydrates to other parts of the tree. So you have the vessels moving up and down, the xylem and phloem, but the ray cells act as sort of the movement between storage locations from inner and outer part of the tree. Ray cells, again, you can see that they're kind of cross-sectioned here, almost like the spoke on a wheel. When you see a tree round, you can actually see kind of like the spokes that move inward, and this is where they're located here. And you can see you can get some movement, not only upward, but also in between, moving towards the center of the tree or moving out from the center of the tree, depending upon where the carbohydrates are stored. There's several factors that affect how trees grow. Remember we talked about adaptation and genetic coding. Well, trees have genes just like we do, and these genes provide a framework for how the tree is going to function over time. And two things play a major part in how a tree develops and how it grows, and that's its genetics or its DNA, but also its environment. So when we put those two together, that will make a determination on the sustainability of that tree and also how it processes physiologically and biological, as well as its overall growth. Now, favorable environmental conditions allow the maximum genetic potential. For example, you may have a maple tree, or we've used a sweet gum tree earlier that's found in Texas, and it grows pretty much year-round, and it may reach its maximum genetic potential because of very few environmental inhibitions. But whenever we get sweet gum, say in a more temperate zone, it may not live out to its maximum genetic potential because of its environment. So there's a lot of things that play a role in that. Some environmental factors include moisture, air, available nutrients. All of those things are going to make a difference in whether or not that tree reaches its full genetic potential as an individual species. So whenever we look at these factors, if any of these are unfavorable and these physiological processes are inhibited, then we can expect the physical size or the genetics to be affected, which causes an adaptation issue that we mentioned earlier, and which will affect the overall plant size and how it grows. Hormones are another one of my favorite topics to talk about because it's something we really don't know a lot about. There's basically 5 major groups of hormones that affect over 2,000 plant processes. Now, we won't talk about that today during this, but it's important that we understand that hormones basically regulate, it's chemical messengers that regulate growth. They're tiny little messengers that are produced internally that affect how the tree grows and its shape and size as well. There are several types in the plant. They have an influence on apical dominance, or the shape of the tree from an excurrent versus decurrent growth habit. They also have an influence on bud growth and elongation. For example, we have apical dominance as a result of production of auxins in the terminal buds, which inhibit the lateral bud growth. Terminal buds and lateral buds interact in a way that are influenced heavily by hormones. So if you were to remove the terminal bud, that will reduce the amount of auxin produced, which allows more cytokinins to affect the lateral buds, and that's when we get that flush of growth on the ends or the tips. This is what we call the auxin cytokinin pathway. This is probably a little bit more information than you need to know, but 2 key things that we need to be aware of is that auxins control root growth, and they're formed in the canopy. Cytokinins are created in the roots, and they're the hormones that primarily affect shoot growth. So again, you get this crossing pathway here, or complex circuitry that allows the tree to grow or have a certain morphology based on the amount of hormones present in the tree. So it's kind of a delicate balance of chemicals that influences the shape and processes within that tree. Auxins are also responsible for tropisms. A couple that you need to know is phototropism, which means, and we've probably done this experiment as a kid, where you plant some seeds and you see the lean towards the light. That's called phototropism. That's basically a reduction in auxin on the sunlight side of the tree, which causes more growth on the outside, which makes it bend. And then geotropism is basically a response of the tree to gravity. And this is real evident in this actual little art display. This was in Massachusetts, where they planted maple trees upside down. And you can see that the trees are actually starting to bend upward as a result. Everything wants to grow towards the center of the earth. And so and the roots know that they're coded to grow down, and canopy is coded to grow up. So regardless of how you plant the tree, for example, if a tree's leaning, it will often upright itself. That's the response of geotropism. And so those 2 tropisms have a major impact on tree morphology. A couple of terms that you really need to know as far as hormonal interactions in response to trees. Remember, apical dominance affects the shape of the tree. If it has strong apical dominance, you're going to get something with an excurrent form, or a strong central leader with an upright growth habit. If you have something that is weak in apical control, then you're going to have more of a decurrent form or a more rounded form. And this is all influenced again through growth regulations by hormones, or the amount of auxins present in the growing points. All right, we've talked a little bit about the plumbing with the xylem and the phloem and the cambium layer, and also talked about the influence of hormones and on tree growth. So let's talk about the food factory of our woody plants and the green leafy parts and what happens and how they contribute to the various plant processes. We're going to start with the outer part and kind of move inward. Branches, twigs, and buds. Remember, so this is an opposite leaf arrangement, so this would most likely be a maple, which it is. And we can see that buds occur all along the twig and at the base of each twig tip. Now, twigs are just small stems that provide support for the leaves and perhaps flowers and fruit, where branches support twigs and trunks support crowns. Twigs are just small stems that provide a support function. They support leaves, flowers, and fruit production if it's available. Branches support the twigs, and then, of course, trunks support the overall crown. So it's a supportive structure that kind of works on a hierarchical basis. Now, twigs and buds really tell the story for a lot of things. Remember, in Tree ID, these are very important components for identifying features on the tree. But one thing that it really helps us determine is the health and vigor of the tree. So this is an example. If we look at the internodal growth where last year's leaf scars were, or bud scars, we can see that the last 3 years, we've had some very distinctive differences in the growth pattern. So we look to see the current year, not really great growth, so probably some environmental stressors. The year before, not too great as well, but the year prior to that, quite an extension of growth. So there's a lot going on here that's telling a story that says, hey, last couple of years, tree's been under stress. So we need to look at those twigs to help determine a couple things. If the tree is vigorously growing and perhaps needs some nutrition program to improve a deficiency, or it can also have an influence on our pruning dose as well. We'll talk about that more a little later. But again, use those identification tools to help you prescribe your treatments. Also talk a little bit about dormant and latent buds. Oftentimes these occur, they're meristematic growing points that are usually suppressed within the growing tissue. They usually originate from first year growth, but they like these latent dormant buds, they kind of lay dormant beneath the bark and they're present all throughout the tree. But it usually takes some type of stimulus. And we'll oftentimes see these whenever we have an extreme stimulus, such as excessive pruning, or perhaps a tree is going into a state of retrenchment. And this is an adaptive iteration process to try to create more canopy, more green, more food productive factories for the tree's benefit. So oftentimes we'll see these little buds develop as a response to maybe even more vigorous growth. So it's usually some type of stimulus that reveals a meristematic growing point that's responding to something external. So nothing to be alarmed about. Just know that when you see them, there's usually something going on in the tree physiologically that's triggering that growth. Now let's talk about what some of the components are within the leaf. One of the most important processes on the planet is photosynthesis. And trees make its own food with this process. This is probably, again, the most important chemical reaction on the earth, is it provides the initial energy for all the food sources in all food chains. It's a building process, if you will. So you really don't need to know the chemical reaction to it, but what we need to understand is that it takes carbon dioxide and water combined with the energy from light to create the glucose and oxygen that is necessary to create carbohydrates for energy. And so it's kind of a building process. And the reason I say that is because there's also a breakdown process as well. Photosynthates are usually found in the form of sugar, and they're very small, complex molecules that are moved in the form of carbohydrates. And these are the building blocks for many of the processes and tissue found within the plant. They also can be stored in the form of starch as well. So again, where the photosynthates are and how many and how much depends upon health and vigor of the tree, and also the current requirement. So it may store a lot of carbohydrates if the tree is vigorously growing and has a great growing environment, or it may need to count on those reserved carbohydrates if the tree is suffering from drought or some environmental stress where photosynthetics are on kind of a downhill slide. Now, respiration is what we call the breaking down process. So this is just the opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis creates the food, but without respiration, it can't use the food. So what this does is break down those sugars into a usable form of carbohydrates so that the tree can actually utilize it. And so it's light independent. It means it can happen day or night, but the majority of our respiration happens at night. But it also takes place in the absence of photosynthesis. So it relies on stored energy in order for respiration to take place. But it's important to remember that photosynthesis has to exceed respiration. So it's kind of like a bank system. So you can't take out any more money than you actually put in, or you shouldn't. And if you do, then you start putting a strain on the systems and the processes, just like your bank account. So it works kind of on a balanced system. So we rely on photosynthesis to create a lot of photosynthates and carbohydrates. And then we rely on respiration to break these down to a usable form. So it's kind of like the photosynthesis creates, respiration uses, and it's a very delicate cycle that keeps the tree alive. Transpiration is another physiological process that's very important for the uptake of water. Now, transpiration is basically just an evaporation or loss of water from the leaves in the form of water vapor. And that's also what kind of gives us that extra cool feeling in the shade. It cools the leaves. It reduces the amount of heat in and internal pressure in the leaf. And this is what allows us to take up water from the roots. It's this transpirational pull that pulls water up through the xylem vessels in that column of water. So as the water's leaving, because of the cohesion of the water molecules, they're all attached. So when one pulls, it just keeps pulling and pulling and pulling. And so as the water is escaping through the stomates, through transpiration, it's actually pulling more water up. So we rely on that transpiration process to maintain a constant supply of water to those cells. So, and it happens all through these little tiny cells called stomate cells. And they are regulated by a lot of different things, ambient air temperature, humidity, just environmental heat. There's a lot of things that influence that, and basically the tree regulates its own temperature, internal temperature through these stomates. And really what it comes down to as far as tree health and growth and vigor, it's really all about the carbon. It's all about the C. You know, we talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all those essential elements, but the entire growth of the tree is funded by carbon in the form of carbohydrates and releasing that energy through respiration. It provides structural carbohydrates and non-structural carbohydrates for different processes. And anytime we do anything to deplete those food factories, either through stress or pruning or other practices, especially excessive pruning or excessive type of intervention, then we deplete that tree's ability to store and create food. So our influences on the tree affect the physiology of that tree. That's why it fascinates me so much, is to understand how the tree works, because we can be a better arborist and know exactly what to do and how much to do by understanding how the tree grows. So anytime we get a carbon deficit, then we're going to have a deficit in its ability to process food, and also survive. All right, we've talked about the green leafy parts, talked about the twigs, and we talked about the plumbing in the tree. Now we're going down into the roots, down to actually one of the most important parts of the tree that's out of sight and out of mind, and the most difficult and challenging to understand. So a realistic picture of a tree. So I kind of was just checking to see what normal, typical people understand. Non-tree people, okay? Those are atypical to me. But anyway, I asked my wife to draw a picture of a tree, and this is kind of what it looked like. My wife's a nurse, smart, beautiful, well-educated woman, and she didn't know anything about trees until she met me, of course. But typically, people think that tree roots grow as deep and wide and long as the canopy. So if you got a 50-foot tall tree, then you got a 50-foot deep root zone. Well, we know that's not the case. In fact, the more realistic view of a tree is a very long, extended network of roots that extend at least to the drip line and sometimes 2 or 3 times the drip line of the tree. Trees can grow very deep roots. We've seen there's evidence of 30-foot tap roots in some countries. It's certainly not the United States, but by and large, the majority of our roots are found in the upper 2 to 3 feet of the soil profile. And the reason being, again, these tree roots are very opportunistic. They're only going to grow where it's easiest for them to grow. And usually that's laterally, because once they hit something solid, then they're going to start moving laterally. And this is typically what we see and can expect. So that paints a picture of how we do a lot of our practices, especially root invigoration or any type of response from damage. And we'll talk about that during tree preservation and construction damage. So let's talk about the individual components of the root system, what I call the flares and the hairs. So the root flare, we kind of alluded to earlier when we talked about tree planting. So the root flare is where we have that kind of specialized area that gives rise from the trunk to the suberized waxy tissue that's found on the roots. The root flares are usually large buttress roots that are primarily responsible for anchorage. They also are very effective in dissipating energy. Where we see the root hairs, now these aren't actually root hairs. These are more of fibrous roots. Root hairs are actually invisible to the naked eye. We need microscopes to be able to see that. But we often call these fibrous roots root hairs when actually it's a misnomer. But it does give, these fine roots do give rise to root hairs, which are responsible for the uptake of water and nutrients. As I mentioned earlier, root absorption takes place through the root hairs. Remember also we talked about the rhizosphere. This is where the rhizosphere occurs as well. So it kind of surrounds these root hairs in this very small area and forms that biofilm that protects it as it moves through the soil from abrasion and damage from rocks and soil and clay and particles and all those things. Very sensitive to soil types and pH. Just think about when we talked about the burn factor and salinity and so forth with fertilizers. Just think how easy it would be to scorch these little root hairs. And this is what's responsible for the uptake of those chemicals, those nutrients, and water. So we want to make sure that we don't do anything to damage these. There's thousands and millions of these tiny root hairs all over the roots of the trees, but they're very important for absorption, and we want to minimize the amount of damage that we inflict on them. Here's another example you can see along a root here, all these little hairs. Again, this is where the absorption takes place. And that is where the rhizosphere is found as well. Now, we talked about fungal roots or mycorrhizae a little earlier, but just a little reminder, you can see where they attach to the roots and actually expand the absorptive abilities of those roots. So it's, again, that symbiotic relationship where the tree provides food for the fungus and the fungus actually provides food for the tree. So as I mentioned earlier, they're found in nearly every soils, but varying in quantity and viability as well. So what's the point of all this? Well, again, roots perform a very important function. They're not just an anchor. They're also used for storage and reserves as far as carbon. They're responsible for absorption and conduction of water and nutrients, and any type of impact, and usually it's people pressure type of impacts, can have an adverse effect on the tree. You see 3 of the primary examples, and we'll get into more detail about these during construction damage. But you can see compaction and erosion due to pedestrian traffic, adding soil to the existing root zone, and then cutting and damaging roots for hardscape or sidewalks and streets. Have a profound impact on the survival of that tree, and we'll get into more of those details here shortly. I mentioned tree root invasions earlier. Again, this was some shots from a friend of mine. He's manages a community, and these are photographic images in old water pipes and sewer systems. And you can see where there was already a crack in the grout, so of course the root's going to exploit that and get in there. There's a crack in this water line, and as a result, the roots are going to get in there, and they can actually completely fill that pipe if they go undetected for a very long time. But they won't actively penetrate anything solid. Now, kind of finishing up with the tree biology part, is talking about the wound defense system. So Dr. Alex Shigo from the U.S. Forest Service developed this model of decay response back in the 70s. Shigo's ideas led to a lot of changes in how we practice arboriculture. And he talks a lot about the tree's defense system and how it affects compartmentalization and how this all works with arboriculture practices. And so I'm going to give you a little detail on that, but not get into the weeds too much. Some things that are important to understand. Trees seal or heal differently than people, whereas we completely create new cells in response to damage, where oftentimes a tree will compartmentalize or wall off a wound through the 4 different types of walls or layers, boundary layers that the tree creates in response to the wound. So you can see this is wound wood tissue that was created as a response to construction damage. This is actually a wall 4, the barrier zone that's created, and eventually we want this to seal up completely as we did on this oak tree with an old pruning wound. So that's the whole goal or intention of coated, is to seal off or occlude that wound as quickly and as effectively as possible. So what does coated do for the tree? Well, there's 4 distinct walls that you need to be aware of and remember, okay? So this, I guarantee you'll want to know for further reference. So wall 1 is basically resist the vertical spread. So whenever, let's say the tree's injured, let's say you smack into it with a lawnmower, okay? You've damaged the cambium layer, removed the bark, now all of a sudden there's a wound there. So whenever you damage that, remember the vessels run vertically in the tree. So you basically severed that. So as a result, there's all types of fungal organisms, bacterial organisms floating around in the rain, in the air. And whenever a tree is injured, it actually puts off these phytochemicals, kind of like the Cracker Barrel, if you will. You drive by it, you smell it, and you're like, huh, wonder where that's coming from. Well, these fungal organisms are drawn to that. And so they penetrate the wounded area. They need an opportunity. They don't just naturally invade healthy tissue. Most of our fungal organisms need an opportunity or invitation. So what they do is they insert their hyphae, excrete some enzymes that actually decay the wood, and it'll move vertically in the tree. This is the weakest wall, so it moves up through the xylem vessels and starts invading the rest of the tree. Now the second wall resists the wall spread inward, so kind of like from the bark inward. So if this is the wound area, it would try to resist. So you can see this boundary layer here. These are boundary layers of phytochemicals that the tree is trying to create to prevent that decay from moving all the way into the heartwood. And this is the second weakest wall. Now wall 3 resists the lateral spread, so that means around this direction, so radially. And you can see where there's some boundary layers through here and here where the edges of the decayed wood is. This is, most of this is incipient decay. It's not necessarily fully decayed, delignified, but again, it is affected by the fungal organism. And this is one of the strongest of the reaction zone compartments. Now, wall 4 is that area that forms actually new tissue. And this is what we call the barrier zone. So take a mental picture of this little infographic here and remember that, because you're going to have to know what these are. And this goes from weakest to strongest. So this is the weakest vertical spread, the strongest, because this is highly lignified, very dense tissue that actually resists decay very well. And so wall 4 is a very strong barrier zone against further decay. So the whole goal behind COAT-IT, or this boundary-ish model of defense, is we want the wound to occlude or seal off. So once that decay is encapsulated, then it doesn't have the environment to proliferate. It needs a host, it needs an environment, and it needs a moisture. And so all those things, and air. So once all those things are occluded, then the fungus kind of slows down and almost goes into a state of dormancy or less activity. And that's what we want to do. So once it's injured, boom, the race is on. So either the tree is able to compartmentalize and seal it off, or the fungus actually takes over and proliferates much faster than the tree can seal or heal. So again, it's a constant battle between the two once a tree is wounded. So here's another example of compartmentalization. You can see all the walls except, of course, the vertical walls. But you can see the boundary layers where they're trying to seal it off, wall 2, from going any further into the tree. Wall 3, you can see this incipient decay, or this light colored area where that's another boundary layer to keep it from going radially. And then wall 4 is this new ram's horn or new wound wood tissue that's trying to seal it up. So all of those there are trying to work together to try to create that defense system to prevent that decay from getting any worse in the tree. And you can see, really, every time you look at a piece of wood, raw wood or natural wood, you can see examples of COAT-IT in every piece of wood. And people might look at you a little strange at a restaurant when you're staring at their table, especially if it's not yours. But you can see where this was an old pruning wound, and you can see actually the decay area, the walls here formed. Also, here's a codominant branch, and you can see where the decay has initiated here. But you can see the boundary layers. These darkened boundary layers are where it's tried to compartmentalize that decay. So we see it everywhere. It's a phenomenal defense strategy and a model that has been around for a long time. There's a lot of new research initiated on this now. So stay tuned for current research and new ideas on how to protect trees from wounds and damage. So that kind of wraps up our tree biology and tree physiology module. Gosh, there's a lot there to digest, a lot of information. I strongly encourage you to really digest the food that's presented in the study guide, because typically tree biology and soils are two of the most challenging because we don't use them every day. It's not that we don't understand, it's just not common practice or common information that we discuss and read about. So spend some time on soils and also tree biology, and maybe review this presentation or take a look at the study guide much closer. Well, we want to thank you for participating in the TreeU Certified Arborist Preparation course. We hope that it's been a great learning opportunity for you. If you're watching these videos to obtain continuing education units, be sure to enter the code below in the quiz.